morning. This is Brother Larry Cochran again, coming to you from Southampton Baptist Church. I appreciate you tuning in. We've been kind of out of pocket for a while since my eyes were operated on, and they're now kind of back in sync with everything. But we're going to start a whole new study this morning, and we're going to talk about the God who is there. Let me first of all say to you that if you have become recently a Christian recently and just don't know how it all fits together, what's it all mean, how the Old Testament fit together, this study is for you. If you're one who's just thinking about what the Bible means and wondering what it is to be a Christian, this study is for you. Perhaps you're an older believer who really hasn't spent a lot of time studying the Bible and kind of still don't know how it all fits together, how Exodus and the exile might fit, or why it's called the New Testament. This study is for you too. If you just want to grow in an understanding of what the Bible means, this study is for you. So we're going to be looking at the next 9 weeks about the God who is there. We're going to start with this morning with the God who made everything. And so we're going to be in Genesis. I'm going to read a couple of verses out of Genesis chapter 1. It says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw the light was good and separated the light from darkness. God called the light day, the darkness he called night. And there was evening and the morning, the first day. It goes on through 6 more days, and as God creates the rest of the rest, on the second day, it's the sky and the water. He separates them, the sky from the water. Third day, land and sea appear. Fourth day, sun, moon, and the stars are created. Fifth day, fish and birds to fill the waters. The sixth day, animals to fill the earth, and on the sixth day, man is made. I also want to read to you from Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 31. It says, then God said, let us make man in our image and our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful, increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over every living creature that moves to the ground. Then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant in the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with it to seed it. That will be yours for food, and all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds of the air, and all the creatures that move on the ground, everything that has breath of life in it. I give every green plant for food, and it was so. And God saw all he had made, and it was very good, and it was evening and the morning, the 6th day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in that very way. And it says on the 6th day that God rested. So we're looking at this whole concept this morning of God who made everything. The first thing I want to talk to you about, for example, it says in the beginning. I don't know how much you know about the universe that our Earth is in, or how much the galaxies that are out there. But I've heard recently, and it says that the galaxies, our galaxy itself, the Milky Way galaxy, is spinning at 490,000 miles per hour. Even at that speed, it takes over 200 million years to make one revolution. That's about the vastness of our galaxy. I want to point out there to you. There are many more galaxies out there in our universe besides ours. Says the number of, some say the number of the stars in the heavens is as much as the sea on the seashores of our ocean. So I just want to point out how that little phrase in the beginning, what all that entails there. So I grew up in a time, perhaps at my age, I'm almost 76, when a lot of people understood the Bible, read the Bible, and kind of knew what the Bible's all about. Increasingly in our society, as time has come along, there's less and less people who read it, less and less people understand it. Some have never read it, or never read it really closely, put it that way. And so if you're going to really understand Christianity, you have to understand what the foundational documents of Christianity. And they are not just in the New Testament. There are a great many of them there that really set out the guideline. Writings of Paul and Peter in particular I'm thinking about. But you'll find a lot of foundational documents that surprisingly are in the Old Testament. As God begins to lay out his plan of salvation. We actually find in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15. Later on we'll talk about that, with the seed of the woman will crush the head of the serpent, and it's the first expression of the coming of the Savior, Jesus Christ. Now, the Bible itself was written across a period of about 1,500 years. It's written in 3 different languages. If you have a Bible today, and if you're listening today, I assume you're either listening in English. English is not the original language of the Bible. The Old Testament itself was written in Hebrew, and then a Hebrew-like language called Aramaic, and then the New Testament in Greek. So what you have an English Bible. You have a translation of the Bible itself. You don't have the original language. But those translations are faithfully done in most cases, and so if you do have an English Bible, make sure you have one that's reputable and easy to read. There are 66 books in the Bible, spread across that 15-year span of period of time. And sometimes it's hard to understand the Bible, the language that's being used when you look at the Old Testament, especially, and sometimes the New Testament. You're looking at language that we don't speak in that form and fashion. It's a lot of symbolism that doesn't mean anything to us, but meant something to people who wrote it down. And we're also removed some 1,000 years away from the period of time when this language was used. This language was written down. And so people who wrote this all down in the beginning understood it, as we might understand English today. But as time's gone along, some of these languages are no longer spoken anymore. Even the Greek language of our day is like our English language, in the sense that the Old New Testament Greek is not quite the same as the Greek language we speak today. And the similarity that the Shakespearean English, the Shakespeare writing his plays, is not quite our language today, but we can't understand it. So sometimes it's hard to understand all those kind of things. We call these books, these 66 books, different books, but actually what the Bible really means, if you use the word Bible, it actually just means the book. And so that'll help you understand it possibly also. But what we Christians believe, that this book right here that's laying to my right, set on this podium here, discloses the God of creation, the God that we are responsible to, the God who created all that's out there and created us. And we believe this book gives us a full understanding as best we can at this particular time. And so that's why we want to look at the foundational documents that make up Christianity. So that's our claim as Christians. This book discloses the God that we're responsible to. The first verse we're going to look at is God who made everything, and that's the first book of Genesis, which I just read to you. Now, there's some individuals out there, and you may be one of those, perhaps you have somebody talk about it, who might say that what we find in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2 is not compatible with science, that if you're a scientist, you cannot be a Christian because it's not compatible. So much of our time are convinced that that's true, but it's not true. That's a false assumption. We'll get on a little bit later on about that. But they just believe that science is not compatible with what it says here in Genesis, and therefore, because it's not compatible, we should be just simply ignored and not paid attention to. But before we get any farther, we have to also talk about these first 2 chapters. There's ambiguity, I guess, even among Christian believers about what it says here in those first few days. For example, those days it talks about. For example, some think that those days are actually, as counted out there, are actually 24-hour periods, and that only about 4,000 years are between what it says here in Genesis and our particular time. So there's those Christians who might believe that way. Others see these days as its vast, innumerable ages, perhaps millions of years, and not specifically to a 24-hour period. And some think that it's just a kind of literary device in the sense it means, he's talking in terms of days, doesn't mean 24 hours, doesn't mean a period of time, but he's talking in terms of just an example of how it was done. And so it may not be described in a literal week is what you're saying. I don't think there's any need for us to argue about those particular different ways of seeing what it says here in Genesis. It's not what it says in the sense of the period of time It's what it says in the period, the truth about Jesus, truth about God creating the world, what he did during that period of time, whether it be those who think in terms of 7 days, those in terms of things of endless millions of years, whatever the concept might be. It's not for us as Christian believers to argue about something that is not going to get us anywhere in our walk in Jesus Christ, for example. I don't do that, and I don't suggest you do it either. So it's sufficient for us to understand that it's more historical application here. And what I mean by historical is telling us how the world was created and who created it. Whether it was done in that span of time of millions of years or done in that span of time of 7 days, as you might understand it, is not really that important. The important thing is what it tells us is who did it and why he did it. And so that's what we want to look at. Now, let's look at this claim, even about the claim of science sometimes is not as hard and fast and as you might think it might be. There's some ambiguity among scientists about how the world came into being. For example, many think that Christian, because if you're a scientist, you cannot be a Christian, but that is, again, I said that's not true. There are many college professors and many scientists who are Christians, and in many of our churches scattered across our country and around the world. I was surprised that most of those are scientists, are professors of science, researchers in science, and are also mathematics. So they don't tend to be in the English literature or arts or psychology. I think the reason being because our universe and our world is so well ordered and so built upon mathematical equations in the sense of it. We look at that whole process. So there are quite a few scientists who are believers, and I've even read about some who became believers because they studied more and more about the universe and how it's set down and the organization that's there. They had to come to a concept what we'll look at a bit later on is intelligent design. Somebody designed it. To say the world evolved in the sense of what we're talking about, the statistically analysis we'll get into a bit later on, it's an impossibility that all those things could come together to create life. Here's an example of that. It's like you saying or me saying, that we go out and we pile a whole lot of scrap iron or metal out in my driveway. And given enough time, we'll go back and we'll find my 2015 Chevy Colorado pickup sitting there where the scrap metal used to be. That's how you have to view this concept of evolution. It will not play itself out in the sense of it all that time. There's not enough, I've even read there's not enough time, even if we give this world a lot of millions of years, even billions of years, for all that evolution to have happened. But anyway, that's a whole other issue we'll look at. And so scientists do believe in this. Now, there's another concept we kind of think about as we move along quickly here. You may have heard of something called the Big Bang Theory, which I remember studying in college and even in high school some years ago. It says it supposedly took place about 15 billion years ago for an unimaginable condensed mass. And that became our universe. Now, there is a scientific evidence that our world is increasingly expanding. It's like an explosion took place, and all these different stars and planets are all moving away from one another. There is evidence about that. But if you look at the Big Bang Theory, you have to come to another question. Let me just point out to you, it talks about a small condensed mass. Both things I've read about says it's about the size of this lifesaver that I have here in my finger. It's about a little bit larger than a marble. The question I have, if you say this is what happened, where did this mass come from to start with? Who made it? Even if God used the Big Bang Theory, somebody had to make the mass that became the Big Bang Theory. So so we look at that concept, and even do you want to go that route, somebody still had to make the mass that made that happen. So the last one's intelligent design that I talked about. That everything is so well designed in our universe, and all laid out and organized in a well-designed fashion. Even taking our human body and the way it has all the different systems working together so efficiently, it's been well designed and well put together. Even the plant life around us, the trees, and everything about our creation is well designed and organized. And that's where the idea of intelligent design comes from. And I would tend to think more in terms of intelligent design. I mean, somebody that had intelligence designed all that. Now, I'm not much for designing things, but there are people who do design. They lay out plans for houses and plants, and they lay out plans for building cars. They built gigantic skyscraper, but somebody has to design it. They just don't appear from nowhere without somebody sitting down and saying, this is the way it's going to be built, this is how we're going to do it, this will look like in the end. So I'm more of I do lean toward the intelligent design concept. We're so complex in our living organism that it just is no possibility of all of that evolution come together at the right time. I mean, if you look at the human eye itself, human eye is so complex. How does human eye, how does all that come together? I mean, how many, the light coming into my eye right now that I can see and in your ear you can hear, all that had to be there to begin with for you to see and to hear. It just doesn't evolve across the ear. I mean, you just get a pupil first, you get a lens first, is your eye round first, is it oval? The muscles in the eye, I mean, all that has to come together at one time for it to operate. In the same sense, if I went out and wanted to have a car and I just set the block down there and didn't put any pistons in it, it's not going anywhere. But if I have the entire engine and it's all worked up right, it's going to start and move the vehicle. That's intelligent design. And so we look at this, again, we talk about it, and we look, and if you do look out at nature, nature does indeed talk about the glory of God. Just looking out this morning, I was out on my back deck and I looked up and the very bright moon with a little bit of clouds around it, and I was standing there thinking how bright it was. Now, if you don't understand this, you might think the moon itself is like the sun. It's got a source for that light coming to you. That's not it at all. What the moon does is reflect the sunlight, and we see it because of that. But that talks about the glory of God. That was made. That's out there. It shows God's glory. It shows God's glory in the stars and the heavens, the countless numbers of those things. And it's always telling us about God is and what He's done. And so, what are some of the things that Genesis chapter 1 and 2 tells us about God? Let's quickly talk about that. It simply says, God is. It says, in the beginning, God created. Well, it says, in the beginning, God. And what it tells us is that God simply is. What that means is that there never has been a time, and never will be a time, when God didn't exist or will not exist. He's always existed. Now, we have difficulty understanding that because we're finite creatures. I'll soon be 76 years old this month. I can think back to a time, I don't remember the time, but I know there's a time when I was born. So at that particular point, I began to exist outside of my mother's womb. So there's a time when I wasn't here, and there's a time when I am here. But God is not operating in that fashion. And it's hard for our finite minds to understand the fact that something has always existed, because we live in a world where things come and go. Things are born, things die. We buy a car, we get rid of a car, we build a house, we buy another house burns, tornadoes come, things start, things end. We're well familiar with the concept of life and death. So we don't quite grasp the concept of this idea that something has always existed, always been alive, and there was a time it wasn't here. But that's the nature of who God is. It says God is. It doesn't try to explain or even prove the existence of God in Genesis chapter 1 here. It simply says God is. It's not. It doesn't do anything to explain that away. It simply says He's here. He always has been here. That's the concept we look at. And so if He is indeed always been here, and He is our Creator, He has the right to evaluate us and the moral right to look at us and say this is right and this is wrong, this is sinful, this is not sinful, and to cause consequences for our misbehavior. And that's really, lack of a better term, we'll call a good parent. I raised 4 children. I have 12 grandchildren and some great-grandchildren. I, as a parent, would never allow any of my children just to do what they wanted to do, run wild as they wanted to run wild, and not discipline, not have consequences for their actions. We do that as a parent, if we're really a good parent, because we love them, we want to keep them from harm and hurt, and only a parent who doesn't care, who doesn't love, just allows their child to do anything they want to do, no matter what it is. God operates off that kind of concept is He can't allow His creation, we who have been created, to do what we want to do without consequences. That would say He didn't care about us and He didn't love us. So God made everything that is not non-God. So we talk about this. So God always has been. Second thing is God made everything that's not Him. That means everything. It means all the universe. It means our planet. It means everything on our planet. Everything that's out there God made. Um, Even the stuff we have that we wear and the things that here in this building, the initial thing is God made that. Wood, for example, God had the concept of trees. The clothes I wear here happen to be a cotton. It came from cotton originally. I didn't make that. Man didn't make cotton. He just uses what God made. So God made everything that's not God. Even the steel our cars made from is made from iron originally. So he made everything that is not him. And his existence is what we call self-existence. That's another concept that's hard for us to figure out. He exists in himself. He really doesn't need us. He created us because he loved us and he cared about it, and in his heart he cared about creating in creation something for him to create. But he's self-existent. He's infinite, it's called. You and I, we're finite, which means there's a time where we're born and there's a time we're going to die. That's the finite of it. But infinite means not finite. So he never was born in the sense that, well, I was born, and he's not going to die in the sense that one day I'm going to die. But he's infinite. So my existence and your existence depends actually upon him. He's the original giver of life. If you go back later on, we'll read as the weeks progress, we'll talk about how he created Adam and Eve from the clay of the earth. He simply said he breathed life into them. God gave life. And since he gave us life, we're responsible to him for how we live that life. That's kind of how you want to look at it. He gave us his life. He gave it to us. He gave us a time of existence. And it makes us responsible to him for how we use this life. Much of our world today thinks they're only responsible to themselves and nobody else. Or if they can get by with it and the law doesn't catch them, that's all right too. Not responsible to the law. Just look at what goes on in some of our major cities. All this looting and going around raiding these stores. That's simply saying I'm not responsible to anybody but myself, and I made the decision, it's all right to do that. And there's only one of him. That's the next thing he'll tell us about God. Now it's kind of confusing because we see even here in the Old Testament the concept that it looks like there's a triune God. It talks about let's make God in our image, we in our image. And we look in the New Testament where it's fleshed out the Holy Spirit and fleshed out Jesus Christ the Son. And that's kind of a confusing thing for us because it's hard for us to understand how this oneness can be in three. But it's not for us to try to understand that because, again, we're looking through our finite minds who are trying to understand this concept of God. Let me give you a little illustration. It's kind of in this sense, in this term of it. If I could speak to an ant, and I tried to explain to an ant, say, the rocket ship that went to Mars, or went to the moon, or the space shuttle, you think the ant could grasp that idea? If I tried to explain to him the concept of my truck and how it works, that's something the ant won't grasp, can't understand. In that sense, we're kind of like the ant. We're trying to understand and grasp something that's way beyond our ability to do that. And we're just going to drive ourselves kind of round and around in circles trying to figure it all out. But there is this triune God, and it's fully fleshed out in the New Testament. I don't quite understand it all, I admit that, but I do accept it because it's presented there, and it's talked about there. And so we find it there in the New Testament. Number 4, we know about God. God is a talking God. We find him here talking when he says, let these things come into existence. We find, and even more so, we find him talking to Adam and Eve a little bit later on. So he's a talking God. And so we know that about him. And he also says everything that God has made is very good. We read it to you a few minutes ago, what God has made. This is before the fall of man, before sin comes into the world. Everything God made up to that point, before Adam and Eve sinned, God says was good. So that's the last time everything was good. After Adam and Eve's fall, we had a lot that was not good anymore. And so he proclaims, he says all that about himself. Let's move on here quickly to day 4. Day 4 says some of the things we can think about ourselves, about human beings. We are made in the image of God. Now, what does that mean? What does it mean to be made in the image of God? Let's briefly look at that. First thing is that since he's a talking God, we can speak. You can hear me today. I say the words, you're hearing that. So in that sense, we're like God. There's also a concept of creativity. Now, that doesn't mean that I can create something from nothing as God did, but we can create as human beings. We create all the time. We create, buildings. We create vehicles. We create houses. We write books. We create TV programs. We're very creative in that sense of it. We make pottery. We make clothes. Part of my hobby is I buy and sell antique furniture, and so I don't create the antique furniture in the sense of that, but my creative comes in when I restore that, when I try to get it back like it originally was, and I do that what it takes to restore it. There's a bit of creativity in that. So in that sense, we're creative. We can do those things. And number three, I just kind of touched on it there a while ago, but we have the capacity to work. God worked across whatever period of time that was, create the heavens and the earth and all there was, the capacity to work. We work every day. If you're still working, I'm basically retired, but when you work, you have capacity to work. You have a capacity to make a living. You have the capacity to understand your job and do what it takes to do that job. So in that sense of capacity. We were originally created with a moral concept, which was kind of messed up with Adam and Eve, but that's a lot like God too. God had a moral concept of what is good. And before, in the Garden of Adam and Eve, we had the same kind of moral concept. It's only after the fall did we really understand what sin is, what sin would do to us. So, but there are some ways we're not like God. Let's make that clear too. I'll make that very clear to you. We're not self-existent. God is self-existent. Always been there, always be there. I'm not self-existent in that sense of it. I was born, I will die. Something, I was created. Life gave to me. Now, I understand the concept of my parents and how they married and how I came to be. But God first had to give the life that my parents had before they could pass that life to me. And down through the generations prior to them, all the way back to Adam and Eve, when life was given, life has been passed down from generation to generation, all the way to myself today, and through my children, into my grandchildren, into my great-grandchildren. So in that sense, we're not like God in that sense of it. But we do bear an image. He tells us to rule over our world and to be a steward of it, to take care of it. Of course, sin interfered with that, and that we have polluted our world. We waste resources. We trash our world up. We're no longer the great stewards we ought to have been, but that's what God created us for. And He created us most of all those things. He created us to be centered on Him. And that's, again, the problem that sin brought into the world. We were created to be centered on God, but sin entered in, and most of what we're centered on today, if you're not a believer, and even believers have a difficult time sometimes, but if you're a non-believer, I can tell you what you're centered on. You're centered on yourself. And even Christians sometimes find themselves in a bad position, being centered on self. So you're either going to be God-centered or self-centered. And to be self-centered and not God-centered is wrong. The Bible teaches that to us. And so and it says God made human beings male and female. I'm about to say something I know some folks are going to disagree with and aren't going to like what I'm about to say. But I'm going to tell you, God made Adam and Eve, and He did not make Adam and Steve. That's exactly how it worked itself out. Homosexuality is a sin. The Bible's quite clear about that. Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because of sin. Where do you think the word Sodom comes from? It comes from the word Sodom and Gomorrah in the Bible, where men laid with men and women laid with women. Transgender is an affront to God. There are only two sexes, male and female. And the only reason that why they try to silence people like myself who are Christians and silence the Bible, because what the Bible says about that. They want to silence the truth. Silence the truth doesn't change it. It's still true. Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. God does not sanction same-sex marriage. That's wrong. Man does that. Sinful man does that. But it's still wrong. What He sanctions here, what we find in the book of Genesis, is Adam and Eve being married and men and women being married, but it doesn't sanction same-sex marriage. It never has, never will be. So before we get next week, we're going to look at the fall of man, and these first two chapters, Genesis 1 and 2, are the background for the fall. You have to know how good things were in chapters 1 and 2 for you can really understand how things got so bad when Adam and Eve sinned in Genesis chapter 3. First, you have to know how great it was, how good it was. That's what we're going to look at next week at the fall. And so our vision, how we see all this stuff, visions, our concept of the world around us. For example, a Christian, I should be Christ-centered. And what I view for my life will be centered on Christ. But there are many out there, there's a term called hedonism. I won't worry about it. I'm going to define it for you. You know it's true because in our society today, this is exactly what goes on. Well, the point of this is, hedonism says this: seek the satisfaction of your desires is the highest good and aim of your life, and what it should be. It's kind of like the old beer commercial. You know, get all the gusto you can get. Your greatest aim in life is to satisfy yourself and get all this self-desire fulfilled. Basically what it says is be self-indulgent. That's not God-centered, it's not Christian, but it is sin-centered. And so that's a popular view today. We look at this whole idea of that. And so so the Bible says creations or human beings, because we've been created, we are accountable and we're responsible to God. That's what the Bible tells us also. So just because you say God doesn't exist, perhaps, in your mind, or you're not going to be accountable to God, does not remove the truth. He does exist, and you are accountable because you've been created by Him. And because you've been created by Him, you're responsible to Him. Next, we're going to look at Son is a God who does not wipe out rebels. We're going to look at the fall of man. We're the rebels in the sense of rebellion against God. Before I came to Jesus Christ, I was a rebel. If you're not a member, if you're not a believer in Jesus Christ but saved by Christ, you're a rebel. Even if you're a Christian, and you're not serving the Lord, you're still in kind of rebellious idea, rebelling against His authority. But basically, when we rebel against God's authority, we become rebels. Next, we're going to look at God who does not wipe out rebels, and be thankful He doesn't. Have a God